Just give him a pill, he'll be fine. I cannot miss this flight, Vanessa said, already wheeling her suitcase toward the front door while I sat doubled over on our kitchen floor, chest tightening like a fist closing slowly around my heart, sweat soaking through the shirt I'd put on 20 minutes earlier for a trip to Italy I would never actually take. Our daughter Sophie, 22 years old and home from college for the summer, stood frozen in the doorway holding a bottle of aspirin Vanessa had shoved into her hands on the way out, watching her mother's rental car back down the driveway toward an airport 40 minutes away, toward a first-class cabin on a flight departing in 90 minutes that mattered, in that specific moment, more than whether her husband of 26 years lived through the morning. My name is David Sherwood, I'm 59 years old, and I had never, in 26 years of marriage, experienced anything remotely resembling what happened in our kitchen that July morning, a crushing tightness spreading from my chest down my left arm, a cold sweat breaking out despite the air conditioning, a specific, animal terror I'd never once felt before in my life, the kind that makes you understand, with sudden and complete clarity, that your body is failing in a way that requires immediate professional intervention rather than home remedies suggested by someone in a hurry to catch a flight. Vanessa and I had built what I believed, right up until that morning, was a genuinely solid marriage, 2 successful careers, mine in commercial architecture and hers in luxury real estate, a comfortable life in the suburbs outside Charlotte, 2 children now grown and largely independent. Vanessa had always cared considerably more than I did about the specific trappings of that comfortable life, first-class travel, designer everything, a certain visible standard of living she'd grown up without and had spent her entire adult life determined never to fall short of again, a preference I'd generally accommodated over the years without fully examining what it might mean about her priorities when circumstances ever forced a genuine conflict between comfort and something considerably more important. I used to find something almost endearing about her particular determination, having grown up myself in a household that never wanted for much, understanding intellectually if not always emotionally why someone who genuinely known scarcity might build her entire adult identity around never experiencing it again, though I understand now I'd never fully considered what happens when that determination collides with a moment requiring the opposite instinct entirely. That particular trip to Italy had been 18 months in the planning, a milestone anniversary celebration Vanessa had researched exhaustively, first-class seats booked nearly a year in advance at a cost that had made even me wince slightly when the credit card statement arrived, a villa in Tuscany reserved through some exclusive rental service that required a personal reference to even inquire about availability. I understood, in the abstract, how much this trip meant to her, how many months of careful planning and anticipation she'd poured into it, but I genuinely did not understand, until that morning on our kitchen floor, exactly how much more it meant to her than I did. The chest pain had started subtly around 6 that morning, a vague pressure I initially dismissed as anxiety about the early flight or perhaps something I'd eaten the previous evening, but by 7, as Vanessa moved briskly through her final packing routine, checking passports and confirming our airport car service, the pain had intensified into something unmistakable, radiating down my left arm with a specific, textbook quality I recognized, with a distant, clinical part of my brain, as almost certainly cardiac in nature. I told Vanessa, sitting down heavily at our kitchen table, that something felt seriously wrong, that I thought we might need to call for help rather than continue getting ready for our flight. I want to describe exactly what happened in the next several minutes, because I've replayed them countless times since, trying to understand how a woman I'd shared over 2.5 decades of my life with could respond the way she did. Vanessa glanced at me, genuine irritation crossing her face rather than alarm, and told me I was probably just anxious about flying, that I'd had episodes like this before during stressful travel, a claim that wasn't remotely accurate, since I'd never once in my life experienced anything resembling what was happening to me at that moment. I remember trying to explain, through the tightening pressure in my chest, that this felt entirely different from ordinary anxiety, that something was genuinely wrong with my body in a way I'd never felt before, and watching her expression shift not toward concern but toward a kind of scheduling frustration, as though my body had chosen an inconvenient morning to malfunction rather than an actually dangerous one. When I insisted the pain was getting worse, radiating further down my arm, she suggested, with visible impatience rather than concern, that I take an aspirin and try to relax, that we genuinely could not afford to miss this flight given how far in advance everything had been booked and how impossible rebooking a comparable itinerary would be during peak summer season. By 7:40, with our car service waiting outside and the pain in my chest now unmistakable and severe, Vanessa made the decision that would end our marriage, though neither of us fully understood that yet in the moment itself. She told Sophie, who'd come downstairs drawn by the sound of our raised voices, to give me an aspirin and keep an eye on me, and then she picked up her suitcase and walked toward the door, telling me, over her shoulder, in a tone I can still hear with perfect, painful clarity, that I would be fine, that I always overreacted to physical discomfort, and that she genuinely would not, miss a flight we'd spent 18 months and a considerable amount of money planning. Sophie, God bless her, did not follow her mother's instructions. The moment Vanessa's car cleared the driveway, Sophie called 911, her voice shaking as she described my symptoms to the dispatcher, and stayed on the phone with them, following their instructions precisely, until paramedics arrived 12 minutes later to find me barely conscious on our kitchen floor, my heart, according to the emergency room physician who treated me less than an hour afterward, in the middle of a serious myocardial infarction that would require emergency catheterization and, ultimately, the placement of 2 stents to restore blood flow that had been dangerously restricted for the better part of an hour by that point. I want to be direct about what the emergency room physician told me once I'd stabilized enough for a real conversation, because it matters considerably to understanding exactly what Vanessa's decision that morning actually cost. Every additional minute a heart attack goes untreated increases the risk of permanent cardiac damage or death, and the specific window between symptom onset and treatment, the window during which Vanessa had prioritized a flight over calling for help, had already stretched considerably longer than medically ideal by the time Sophie's independent decision finally got me the care I needed. The physician told me plainly that had Sophie also followed her mother's instructions rather than her own instincts, the outcome might have been considerably worse than 2 stents and a difficult but survivable recovery. Vanessa, I later learned, had turned her phone to airplane mode almost immediately after boarding, a habit she maintained on international flights specifically to avoid what she called unnecessary distraction during the flight, which meant she remained entirely unaware of what had happened to me for the full 8 hours of her flight to Rome, landing, checking her phone, and finding 17 increasingly frantic messages from Sophie, myself once I was stable enough to text, and eventually my sister, whom Sophie had also called once the initial crisis passed. I want to be honest about what I felt lying in that hospital bed, tubes running from my arm, my chest still aching from the procedure, reading Vanessa's increasingly panicked messages arriving in rapid succession once she'd finally turned her phone back on, because it wasn't simple relief that she now understood the severity of what had happened. It was a very specific, very cold clarity about exactly what our marriage had actually been built on for the last 26 years, a clarity that no amount of her subsequent panic or eventual return flight, which she caught within hours once she understood the situation, could fully soften or explain away. Vanessa arrived at the hospital roughly 18 hours after leaving me on our kitchen floor, having spent nearly a full day in transit trying to get back, first arranging an emergency return flight from Rome and then enduring a layover that must have felt, I imagine, considerably longer than any layover ever had before in her life. And I want to give her some credit for the genuine distress visible on her face when she finally walked into my hospital room, distress that appeared entirely real, rather than performed. But genuine distress after the fact doesn't undo the specific, deliberate calculation she'd made that morning, weighing my chest pain against a flight itinerary and deciding, consciously, that the flight mattered more, a calculation I don't believe she'd ever have admitted to making explicitly but that her actions had made unmistakably, undeniably clear regardless of what she might have told herself in the moment. The conversation we had once she arrived was difficult in ways I'm still working through months later. Vanessa tried, initially, to frame her decision as reasonable given what she genuinely believed, at the time, was simple anxiety rather than a cardiac emergency, an explanation that grew considerably harder to sustain once I reminded her that I'd specifically told her the pain was radiating down my arm, a detail she'd apparently decided wasn't significant enough to reconsider her travel plans over. She cried, told me she would never forgive herself, told me she loved me more than any trip could possibly matter, and I believed, in that specific moment, that she meant every word of it. But belief in the moment and trust rebuilt over the following months are two very different things, and I found myself, throughout my recovery, unable to fully return to the marriage we had before that morning, watching Vanessa now with a specific, careful attention to exactly how she weighed inconvenience against my actual needs. Attention I'd simply never thought to apply before nearly dying on our kitchen floor while she drove to the airport. We separated 4 months after that morning, a decision I made rather than Vanessa, once I understood clearly that I could not build the remaining years of my life around a woman who demonstrated, in the single moment that mattered most, exactly where I ranked against a first-class seat and a non-refundable villa deposit. Vanessa fought the separation initially, genuinely remorseful in ways I don't doubt were sincere, but sincerity after the fact doesn't erase what someone reveals about their actual priorities when a genuine emergency strips away all the time for careful consideration and diplomatic framing. Sophie has been remarkable throughout this entire ordeal, staying close through my recovery in ways that have fundamentally changed our relationship for the better, and I think about her, more often than I probably should, standing in that kitchen doorway holding an aspirin bottle, making the independent decision to call for real help rather than simply following her mother's instructions. A decision that likely saved my life in ways I don't believe I'll ever be able to properly repay her for. She told me once, weeks into my recovery, that some part of her had known, watching her mother's face in that kitchen, that something was wrong with the response itself, not just my symptoms, and that the decision to call anyway had felt less like defiance and more like simple common sense finally overriding 22 years of habit around not questioning her mother's judgment. I'm divorced now, living alone in a smaller house closer to my cardiac rehabilitation center, walking 3 miles most mornings on doctor's orders, and building, slowly, a life around people who've shown me, when it actually mattered, that I was worth more than whatever inconvenience my needs happened to represent in that particular moment. My son Marcus, who lives out of state and couldn't be there in those first difficult days, has started calling every Sunday now, something we never quite managed with any consistency before, and I've come to understand that particular near-death experience clarified more than just my marriage, it clarified, for my entire family, exactly which relationships were built on genuine presence and which had simply been coasting on assumption. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand how Vanessa made the calculation she made that morning, but I know, with complete certainty now, that I never again want to be in a position where anyone gets to make that particular calculation about me twice.